Good morning. I'm thinking that hopefully you can all hear me. It's 9 o'clock. There are 9 o'clock on a Friday. There are 10 working days to go until Christmas Day. My name is Patrick Kidd. I'm the CEO of the Future Skills Organisation. We are one of 10 jobs and skills councils that were set up about 4 months ago, and our role is to connect industry to training, to make sure that the training that is delivered across our nation is relevant, up to date, delivering the right people with the right skills at the right time into the economy. So the topic of today's conversation that we're going to have is focused upon probably what is the greatest sort of shock that we've seen really since the start of the internet, maybe even more so than that, and that's the impact of artificial intelligence on the workplace and the skills that are needed in that workplace. So thank you very much indeed for taking the time. We had a huge number of registrations. The numbers are still growing now as we sort of start to move into the actual delivery of this webinar. Our first webinar, rules of the game, will be obviously a presentation. I'll introduce the speaker in just a moment, a panel conversation, and then obviously some questions, and then a poll right at the end. Can I encourage you, please, to make sure that you ask your questions, make your comments. We're really interested to hear what you've got to say. Before we start and I introduce Tom McMahon, I just want to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we are all meeting today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Very, very excited to introduce to you Tom McMahon. We've worked with Tom in a variety of guises. He's a data guy, he's a policy guy, he's an AI guy, and he's a tech guy. And he's been working with us really over the last sort of couple of months on looking at the impact of AI on particularly the work that we do in the Future Skills Organisation, which is finance, which obviously we're focused on the finance, technology and business sectors. Now, I'm just seeing some notes there saying that people, just make sure everyone can hear, because I just saw a couple of things there. Is everyone good for hearing? No technical issues? Somebody give me a thumbs up. All good. Thank you very much. So Tom McMahon, over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks, PK. If Liz can pop up the slides, then we can get underway. And while Liz is doing that, I'm excited to be here with everyone. Thanks for that introduction, PK. I think covered all the main bases. My name is Tom McMahon. I'm a director at Mandala Partners. We're an economic consulting firm. And we're really excited to work with the FSO on this project, which is analysing the impact of generative AI and skills in the workplace. So what I'm going to do today is walk you through this research that we've done. Hopefully it's thought-provoking, and then we'll have our panel conversation to discuss after I finish. So Liz, if you can jump through the first slide. So as PK mentioned, generative AI has blasted onto the scene this year through its kind of breakthrough application being ChatGPT, which was one of the fastest products to ever get to 100 million users globally. And why it's really important is because it's what economists call a general purpose technology. And general purpose technologies have three key characteristics, which you can see generative AI has, which is that it's pervasive, so it can be applied across a lot of tasks, which generative AI can be. It spawns innovation, so things can be built on top of generative AI, and also the more it's used, the better it gets. And in particular, we can see that with the case of the training data that is used by generative AI continuing to improve. So effectively what we're saying here is that, and I don't think that's news to anyone on the call, given we've got over 200 people showing up on a Friday morning to hear about it, generative AI is a big deal. So let's jump through to the next slide. 246, fantastic. Importantly, generative AI is different to the kind of traditional AI automation story that we have heard about, which is often focused on automation. We see generative AI affecting the tasks that we perform in different ways. Some of those tasks will be automated, others will be augmented, and others still will be adapted. Automation has grabbed a lot of the headlines, but there are a couple of really significant issues currently with generative AI that prevent whole-scale automation being used. And the ones that we call out here are legibility and hallucination. So the legibility problem with generative AI is that it's often hard to tell why the machine has done what it has done. And although it can give you a plausible sounding explanation for why it has done what it has done, it's not actually connected to the underlying mechanism. So it's not transparent why the machine behaves in a certain way. And often it's not repeatable either. So it'll generate different output even with the same prompts. And another really important problem is hallucination, which is the tendency for generative AI to make up plausible sounding but wrong answers. And I sort of think of that as like having a person on your trivia team at pub trivia who is very confident but also generally wrong. So, not actually that helpful. So where we think that primarily the impact will be felt immediately is around tasks that can be augmented or adapted. So a lot of times people are talking at the moment about the AI being a co-pilot, so working with the human to complete tasks. Or we sort of see the human being involved as performing a QA or editor role, so generating output from the AI and then checking that it's correct. And we think that that's going to be the kind of primary way that this task is being used, given the dangers around legibility and hallucination that are occurring currently. And importantly, we think that's going to impact less routine skills and more higher level skills initially. So if we can go through the next slide, please. So to determine the impact that generative AI will have on occupations and on the training system, what we did was used estimates of the impact of generative AI and specifically language models, which are the model that you see in ChatGPT that generate text, on fundamental human abilities. So when we go to work and do a job, we're not actually doing a job, we're doing a series of tasks. And our ability to perform those tasks depends on our ability to perform the abilities that are required for those tasks. And some economists in the US have come up with estimates of the impact of large language models on each of these underlying human abilities that we can then translate through to occupations, industries, training systems, etc. And the key thing to keep in mind here is that the impact of generative AI and specifically large language models is primarily important for cognitive and sensory abilities. So things that you do with your brain or at a computer will be impacted relatively strongly. Things that you do in the physical world, be that in a data center or a warehouse or on a building site, will be relatively unaffected, depending on how much the particular task requires those abilities. Next slide, please. So then we take these ability estimates and we map them to other variables of interest. So we know for each occupation what abilities are required for that occupation. And we know for vet qualifications that they have occupations associated with them, which we can map those abilities to. And we can also map it to units of competency by assigning abilities to units of competency to drill down into the kind of atomic level that exists in the vet training system. Next slide, please. Okay, enough preamble. Let's get through to the results. So the primary impact that we'll see on the training system in Australia is at the university level, first and foremost. And we've got a chart here showing the exposure to generative AI based on the skill level of the occupation. And then in the bubbles on the right, the percentage of people performing those skill level occupations with a university qualification. And so for those who aren't intimately aware with the intricacies of our occupation classification system, every occupation in Australia is assigned a particular skill level. So what we see here is that occupations in skill level 1 and 2, which are primarily white-collar occupations, have a greater degree of exposure to AI. And we use an index here of numbers between 0 and 100, where 0 is not affected by, not exposed to AI at all, and 100 is a high degree of exposure. And so, like I said, skill level 1 occupations, 71% of the people in those occupations have a university qualification, have that above average and highest level of exposure to AI. Thinking back to the slide where I called out the difference between adaptation and augmentation and automation, it's important to remember here that if I'm saying that there are, that these occupations and this skill level is exposed to AI, that's not the same thing as saying that that job is going to disappear and be automated by the computer. It's much more likely that what's going to happen is people performing those occupations use generative AI to do their jobs better. And if you've been, lucky enough to get onto the GPT-4 waiting list and get through that, you can see that it's a really powerful tool for augmenting the work that you do in an office job. And we've certainly used it in our firm, and you'll see we've used it, in fact, on this project later on. So it's going to be the job first and foremost for the university system to be on the front line of addressing this. But that's not to say that it's only the university system that will be affected. So if we can jump through to the next slide. We see the same pattern playing out within the vet system. So drilling down into vocational education and training, the higher the level of the qualification in a kind of AQF sense, then the higher the degree of exposure. So graduate diplomas have the highest degree of exposure, and your certificate 1, 2, and 3 have a lower amount of exposure. And that simply reflects the greater degree of cognitive and language tasks that are required to perform those or to undertake those higher level occupations. So, you're going to see this story playing out again and again through this pack, which is essentially that once you develop the intuition that generative AI is going to affect those higher cognitive and language skill tasks and occupations, that's going to flow through into the training system qualifications. So if we can jump through to the next slide. So then we then examined within the vet system, which are the jobs and skills councils that have the greatest degree of exposure to generative AI. And probably unsurprising given the FSO's interest in this particular topic, the finance, technology, and business qualifications have a much higher degree of exposure to generative AI, reflecting the relatively high, in a vet sense, focus on cognitive and language skills in the qualifications that are part of those training packages that underlie the FTB Jobs and Skills Council compared to the other JSCs. What we can see is that while other JSCs have relatively low exposure to generative AI when compared to the FTB JSC, and in fact, all of the other ones are below an average according to our index, there are still qualifications within all of those jobs and skills councils that have an above average level of exposure. So even the relatively unaffected sectors such as agribusiness, manufacturing, mining, and automotive have a high degree of exposure to generative AI. But I think if we're thinking about the urgency of change to these qualifications, or the urgency with which people working in these JSCs will need to engage with business, you could think about this is kind of an indication of urgency. I've seen a couple of people pop up in the chat talking about it's relatively surprising that, for example, manufacturing hasn't shown up higher. And I think it's important to recognize that we're talking about generative AI specifically in this task rather than AI and automation more generally. So while, manufacturing has traditionally been an area where we've focused a lot on automation through robotics, even through AI applications such as computer vision, that doesn't mean that they're going to be affected by generative AI. And it's important to keep that nuance in mind. If we can jump through to the next slide. So within the FSOs areas directly, we can see this dynamic playing out again. So financial services and business services have a relatively higher impact than ICT. And that is due to the fact that there are still quite a lot of occupations within the ICT space, which are more traditional kind of blue collar or technical occupations that require you to go out and interface with the real world, plugging things in, assembling components, doing wiring, etc. And so those occupations have a relatively low degree of exposure, whereas occupations such as software engineering, database administration have a much higher level of exposure. And what we can also see is that while this study focuses on exposure as the overriding characteristic, it does not have a view at this stage on adoption and what areas are adopting the technology. We know, for example, that there are many people who work in software engineering roles who have been at the kind of vanguard of adoption of these technologies, because one of the things that they're really great at is writing code, and speeding up those tasks allows people to increase their productivity. There have been estimates of around 40 to 50% increases in productivity in software engineering tasks from using tools like GitHub Copilot or ChatGPT. Next slide, please. So then we drill down into the individual training packages within the FSO. And while that's primarily of interest to people who are working in those spaces, it also helps you to develop your intuition if you're coming from a space that's not covered by these qualifications. The higher degree of cognitive and language tasks, the greater degree of exposure. And we can see some really large qualifications in here. For example, finance and mortgage broking management has a higher degree of exposure. Financial markets has a high degree of exposure. So, and accounting and bookkeeping, which are kind of really important occupations for which a lot of people undertake this training within the vet system. They will have a high degree of exposure. If we can jump through to the next slide. Within the ICT package, you can see this dynamic that I was talking about on the slide where we had the three things. So none of these qualifications are the qualifications that are important for people who are out working in a data center or working, on site doing IT occupations. Primarily, they've got more of those software-based kind of qualifications that have a high degree of exposure. If we can jump through to the next slide. HR is the big call out here in terms of business services. HR is a job that's fundamentally about communication and about thinking about organizational management, two tasks for which generative AI will be really important. I saw in the chat coming through, someone mentioned, there's a Cert 3 in one of these slides that has a high degree of exposure. And it's important to note that while on average, certificate 3s and 2s have a low degree of exposure, that doesn't mean that all of them have a low degree of exposure. Ultimately, it'll depend on the qualifications that are connected with those, the occupations that are connected with those qualifications as to how much exposure that there is. If we can jump through to the next slide. So we were also keen to examine units of competency, the fundamental building blocks that underpin the training system, to examine which units of competency have a high degree of exposure, because often units of competency are used across different qualifications, even across different training packages. And we wanted to understand at that unit level, rather than just connecting to the occupation, what the exposure to generative AI would be. And in a sort of fun level of circularity, the way we did that was by using generative AI. So for those of you who are not sort of deeply familiar with how the units of competency are described, every qualification in vocational education is underpinned by a set of units of competency, and they have a textual description of what the unit is and how it's performed, so that it can be assessed and can be taught in the vocational system. So what we did is we downloaded all of those descriptions for every unit of competency in the FTB's training packages, and then we fed them into the GPT-4 API, which is the programming interface for ChatGPT, essentially, so that you can perform tasks over and over again without having to type them out. And we had the GPT-4 API classify each of those tasks and the extent to which they would be exposed to AI. And we have an example down the bottom here of a unit of competency, which has got the very snappy code ICT GAM 534, which is manage interactive media productions. And so what the GPT-4 API did is it ingested this text and then provided a score on the main abilities that are required to perform this unit of competency. So written comprehension got a 9, deductive reasoning a 4, and problem sensitivity a 4. And for those people who are not sort of deeply familiar with the description of those ONET abilities, deductive reasoning is the ability to apply general rules to specific problems, and problem sensitivity is the ability to tell when something is wrong or likely to go wrong. Then what we did was we went and did spot checks on those unit of abilities to make sure that the machine wasn't just making stuff up. And what we saw was that on average, we thought the scores were really sensible, and then they provide an overall exposure score for each of the units of competency. And this is an example of a task that generative AI is really good at. It's very challenging to go through and manually classify the abilities that are required to perform a units of competency, because there are thousands of units of competency. People would get tired, they would perform those tasks inconsistently, and it would be very difficult to actually perform this task so that we can analyze the exposure. The machine doesn't get tired, and it does quite a good job of classifying what we call unstructured text. And this approach is being adopted by many researchers. I saw a really great paper by the Reserve Bank yesterday where they've used ChatGPT to go and classify company earnings call transcripts to see whether there would be an impact on inflation. So this is an emerging technique which is really useful for analyzing large amounts of text data. And if we can go through to the next slide, what this shows is for each of those units of competency across the FSO's training packages, what their exposure score is. So again, even within these training packages that have a high degree of exposure to generative AI, there is a significant divergence. Some units of competency have low or no exposure to generative AI. Some have very high degrees of exposure to generative AI. It's not a simple, straightforward story where you can just say, oh, well, ICT is relatively low. All of the units of competency in ICT are relatively low. And so, we're really excited to go through and do this work for all the units of competency within the FSO's training packages, but this technique can be applied more broadly. If others are interested in looking at which of the units of competency are in their training packages that have a high degree of exposure, this technique can just be extended essentially. So I think if the next slide is the last slide. Thanks everyone for listening. I know that was a lot of relatively intense content for a Friday morning, but I'm happy to answer any questions during the Q&A, or happy to answer offline as well if people have questions.
Great, thanks, Tom. I've heard that pitch a few times, and it gets better every time. So really great to sort of hear that. So now we're going to go across, I think, to a bit of artwork. Is that going to be shared now, Liz? Just looking at the screen, and just while that's coming up, I'm going to introduce our panelists. So we've got 4 people from different perspectives who are going to come up with some comments on sort of what Tom's just talked about. So the first one of those will be Tim Allen, who comes from Microsoft, who runs their philanthropy and skills for employability programs. Second will be Cherie Diaz, who comes from the Western Sydney University, and she is their Director of Education and Innovation. And then we've got Anatoly Kovalev, who works with the Acodis Academy. He's the vice president there and a guest lecturer in engineering and information technology at UTS. And he's going to talk about the application of AI through an education training lens. And then finally, we're going to go to Angela Budai, who is the National Policy Officer from the Finance Sector Union. She's also on the board of the FSO, and she's going to give a perspective really that looks at this from a sort of an employee lens. So it'll be really interesting to get those perspectives. So have we got the artwork coming up, guys, or is that not going to happen? Somebody answer me out there.
We'll just check and see if we can get it up in the background, PK.
Okay, thanks. So we'll work to this. What you'll see, hopefully, in the moment is a picture that we've been drawing, which has been capturing Tom's narrative to this point. It's going to continue to build that picture to reflect the panelist conversation. So if that appears midway through, no problem. In the meantime, though, we'll cut straight across to Tim. And great to have you here, Tim. Thanks for your time. Your thoughts, please, in terms of what do you think AI is going to do in terms of, what do we need to do to make sure that AI is an opportunity for all Australians?
Yeah, and thanks, PK, and thanks to the team for putting this on. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Great. Perfect. Yeah, and I suppose one of the things just wanted to probably chat about and obviously get the views of the group here and the people on the call is really just how do we need to think about making sure this era of AI is an opportunity for all Australians and really unlocking this value. So I think we can all agree that we're kind of living through this historic time at the moment. There's of challenge and opportunity. Like the world that we live in faces economic, social, and geopolitical volatility. But at the same time, as Tom, you've kind of explained, like we've got this entering this new age of AI that will fundamentally transform productivity for every individual, organization, and industry on Earth, and help us address some of our most pressing challenges. So it's really interesting, I think, with like Gen AI has the potential to transform various aspects of society, healthcare, education, agriculture, manufacturing, our national security, and obviously for this conversation as well, Tom, that you've outlined with PK is your tech, business, and finance. But with this potential transformation, we also need to ensure economic and growth opportunity reaches every person, every organisation, every community in Australia. So, for me and for us, I think this starts with ensuring everyone has the skills to thrive in this digital and AI-enabled economy. And it's great to see this report from your team, PK, and Tom as well, looking at the foundational elements of our training packages to ensure that we are being future-focused with our thinking. And so, as I said before, like these new skills are really critical to unlock the potential for Gen AI. In a recent report that we did with TCA around Gen AI and the potential significant and economic social value for Australia, the report showed a couple of buckets of value. The first was really, and I think important for this conversation, is improvements to existing industries in terms of productivity and quality. But the second piece is around the development of new business services or products that don't yet exist. In terms of the breakdown, we found that 90% of the 115 billion economic value will come from the first bucket, so productivity gains, and 10% will come from this new business. Once again, like relevant for this conversation, I'd love to get the views of the groups and yourself, Tom and PK, is really around the skills needed to extract this productivity gain. And I think that it really marries well with your report, PK and Tom, that all workers across the economy and role types, specifically in this section, but across all, can benefit from Gen AI. But really, those gains are those huge gains of value. We're going to have to think collectively about to achieve small gains. Think about minutes off tasks, like you said, Tom. This is a cognitive kind of opportunity here. Hours off weeks, days off years, to enable workers across the board to kind of spend time on the higher value tasks that co-pilots can't help with. So taking away that digital debt, or the time that we spend in emails, in meetings like this, transcribing, and allow us to think more creatively, impactfully, but also at the other time, spend time with our families and moving away from the work that we do all the time. So as I said above, it is critical that we need to focus on our new skills required by our current and future workforce. And PK and Tom and everyone love to kind of hear, but we're really seeing some shifts in the way people are thinking about Gen AI as well. Like from barbecue conversations, I think, to office conversations and conversations with our stakeholders. And the way I've been explaining this is really the shift from fear to FOMO, as people are less scared now and more excited about it and what it can mean for us. And I think there's heaps of potential upside with Gen AI. Spoke about the productivity gains, but we're really starting to see some pockets of innovation as well coming through, and people utilizing these new tools in different ways. For me, my favorites include how we can use these tools to reduce barriers of entry to employment, and I think especially relevant for the work that you're doing, PK, with your segments. Can these tools like GitHub Copilot reduce barriers of entry into areas like front-end development or technical consultants, where we don't need as much technical skill sets to be able to move into those entry-level roles? And I think that's a really exciting opportunity for my personal passion area around our marginalized, vulnerable groups or historically excluded groups, like recently arrived refugees or our First Nations communities, as well as what that can mean about employment within this area. The second piece as well, really close to my heart, which I find really interesting, within the education system. So we're here with a lot of educators today, but I'm an ex-teacher myself. So how can these tools help the processes and systems behind? How can it help with lesson plans? How can it help reduce the administration burden of teachers, so we can think about teaching and supporting our future workforce in the things that teachers care about, which is teaching students. Look, but I don't want to take too much of time, but I think also the point that I wanted to chat to you and the group about is that inclusion is important as well. So ensuring that everyone has this opportunity. Everyone's excited about these tools, especially with us at Microsoft. But we've got to ensure that there's equity in access and in design in the way that we move forward. So this has a potential to help many people, but we really need to be intentional in the ways that we engage and support all of our communities, so we can reduce economic and digital divide, not increase it. And that's what we don't want to do. So for us at Microsoft, and I'm sure many other people on the call, it's really about working with our communities. For us, there's a real focus in on supporting young people, supporting our marginalized and vulnerable groups to build AI literacy so they can thrive in what this world looks like, and then also exploring the opportunities within our First Nations community. So I don't want to take too much of the time as well, PK, but I suppose in summary from my side, and love to kind of get your views. I think this report is such a great piece of research to help us progress, because in order to effectively leverage AI, especially how we support our future and current workforce, we need to look at the most important skills for the workforce and embed them into our traditional education systems and skilling initiatives. And like those things are things like critical thinking, data literacy, ethical reasoning, the art of prompt engineering, which are going to be really essential to ensure the responsible and successful integration of AI into our industry. So, for me, as I wrap up, and PK, love to kind of get your views, I think we need to be focused in on innovation in this area and equity in this area, and ensuring that everyone progresses in Australia, and the skills and the training packages that we have for our future workforces are going to be really key and critical to that.
Brilliant, Tim. Thank you. What do we take from that? We take, from that, the idea of the potential for massive impact, the need to have the right skills to enable that impact to become realized. And then I think the other point that you made with way through, which is the fact, there's so much opportunity here and now, the small gains piece, and how the small gains come together so they become big gains. So Tim, great sort of backdrop to that. Thank you for that. And now I'm going to sort of pass across to Cherie. Cherie, if you can sort of come off mute. There you are. Brilliant. So just given the sort of narrative again that Tom has sort of talked about today, what do you think about the impact on universities, but also go to vet as well? Where do you think what does it mean for you? What does it look like? And what do you now need to do to get ahead of this, given the sort of the opportunity as well as the challenge that is going to have to be addressed?
Thanks, PK. And as I said to you previously, just a small question to cover in 5 minutes, so I'll do my best to talk about it. A number of my points will echo what Tim has said, which is great from an alignment perspective and a collaborative opportunity to work together. I think acknowledging that some of the points I'll call out are either already, there's some traction, but there's still plenty of work to do. One is definitely about what are our policies and our guidelines to support in an enabling way, exploring and embedding generative AI. I think the distinction that Tom made earlier about this is about Gen AI versus AI, because AI has been around for a long time, and looking at how do we flex with the pace of evolution happening in the market. There's some great work already being done with our regulatory authorities, but outside of that, I have to commend the New South Wales and the federal school systems for the AI frameworks that they've developed, because they're clear and succinct, and they're a great starting point if you're looking to get your head into that side of things. I think the important thing from a program structure, content and assessment practices, there's a lot of work to be done. Same issue as within the vet sector in terms of the pace of refresh within programs or qualifications or training packages. There are times the timeliness is there for the robust dialogue and the change and implementation needed, but we need to find a way to be more nimble in responding to the technological changes. One of the things that we're doing at Western Sydney University is looking more holistically about how we align our learning outcomes with the Australian Skills Classification to enable that recognition, but also lifting the conversation about the skills that are developed through that learning process. I think support for students and staff, and when I say staff, both professional and academic, is key. And again, this is cross-sector, so it doesn't matter if it's in schools, vet, or higher ed. There's a lot of support needed, extending beyond digital literacy and fluency into AI confidence and competence. And with that comes change and communication management being crucial. At Western Sydney University, we're really conscious of the region that we represent, and that access to tools such as generative AI are an important consideration so that we don't broaden the digital divide for our learners. The importance of education beyond how to use the tool to consideration such as plagiarism and IP and copyright are also important dialogues. Responsiveness and utilisation of the enhanced insights that we can gain from large language models in order to be able to support learners throughout their study, their well-being and personalisation as well are opportunities for us to extend into. I think the enhanced tracking and evidence of outcomes is important, both from a graduate readiness and workforce readiness to build and extend trust within the sector, as well as ability to package that up in a language that students are exiting their studies with an understanding of the value proposition and their prospective career opportunities as well. In order to do that at scale, I think a couple of things need to happen. I think we need to pilot and test in a structured and meaningful way. Within our university, we have an AI pilot committee that I sit on, and we've already effectively tested 2 particular programs in the way that we're embedding generative AI within the university and the programs that we do. We're also proud to be principal sponsors or principal partners with EduGrowth in the establishment of an Australian higher education EdTech innovation network so that we can start to do that in a more systematic and scalable way. I think we need to sense check the accessibility and the assumptions that we make that students coming into our programs are going to be fluent in this technology. We definitely need to work with our technology partners, and Microsoft is one that we work with, Adobe is another, as well as industry, so that we're lifting awareness of how Gen AI is being utilised within the workplaces that we're sending our students out to, whether that's for work integrated learning or for graduate outcomes. And then importantly, I think we need to work out what do we embed versus offer as complementary to the core curricula, because not everything is going to be a natural fit, but offering, in addition to micro-credentials, industry certifications, are also part of our opportunity to leverage Gen AI in practice. We need to work collaboratively across the sector, and the work that and the interaction I have with the Future Skills organisation is amazing and helps me at a university level. But I would also call out the New South Wales Digital Skills and Workforce Compact as a key exemplar of what that looks like in practice. And lastly, I think we need to reflect on what do we stop doing. So rather than layering on, what do we take out or improve or refine processes for? Thanks, PK.
Brilliant, Sheree, thank you. GAI is different to AI. I think that's a really important point for us to sort of walk away from this from, you know, the need for frameworks. How do we manage pace, the speed of change, the importance of collaboration? And I love that last point there that you made, Sheree, which is like, what do we stop doing? There's a real danger that we just keep on doing everything and we don't sort of like take a step back and think about how do we redesign this in a way that's going to make sense. So that's a really interesting sort of overview, if you like, from a sort of an education lens in terms of how does education need to respond, education and training. So now I want to go to Anatoly with his experience to sort of actually look at sort of what's actually happening in terms of the training that's being delivered on a sort of a day-to-day basis around this particular space. So Anatoly, how do you see training and education being impacted by this technology? What's next?
Thank you, PK, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Now, it's probably not surprising for many people on this call that AI and generative AI would, without a doubt, would have a significant impact on training and education in Australia and around the globe. Firstly, we see that generative AI has a huge potential to democratize even further access to education. We're already seeing AI-driven tools that have been used to convert text to speech, speech to text for students with learning disabilities, making course content more accessible. We see a number of high-quality educational courses being translated into multiple languages instantly. Some of the skills that Tim spoke about earlier are essentially becoming available to people around the globe. As long as you have access to the internet, and we know this is still a challenge for many people, but it's also getting better as well. As long as you have access to the internet, you can now enroll into free courses from a number of technology companies such as Microsoft, AWS, IBM, Google, and upskill yourself, learn new skills, and be, I guess, aligned with some of the latest technology that is out there. Nowadays, everyone can become an AI developer, and this is incredible. So access to education will be democratized even further. We're also starting to see that AI tools are now being used for just-in-time learning, providing that on-demand access to new skills and being able to answer questions that employees are having in real time. So this is real-time knowledge and skill delivery applied in the workforce. A colleague of mine last week, who is working for a global marketing company, have implemented a set of tools, and this is just an example, so a set of tools that allow just-in-time education for their campaign managers. And what they do, they analyze, based on the history of all the previous successful campaigns, they're able to analyze product strategies, provide feedback, and provide areas of improvement in a safe and real-time environment, which is incredible. Something that Sheree also mentioned is around the impact on assessment. And there's going to be obviously a huge impact on how we redesign the whole assessment structure, focusing more on skills-based assessment in the education environment, in the vet environment, also in the school environment, but also moving into, and we see a lot of trends moving to skills-based hiring as well. So skills-based assessment, which needs to be redesigned because of all the advances in AI, is directly related to skills-based recruitment. On a slightly separate note, I would also like to think about the impact of generative AI on education from a different angle. We often hear, and this is sort of all over the news, that AI will automate most of the mundane work and we will have this amazing productivity gains of 40 to 60%, which will improve the performance. But it feels to me like in the future, we're sort of aiming to replace mundane work with more meaningful work, but essentially just have more work to do. And I think it's important for us to work with the leaders, to work with the Australian government, and find a way on how we can use all this productivity that AI brings to create more time. More time to invest into education, more time to invest into having the space to be able to reflect on your knowledge, and essentially giving people the opportunity to become better every day. And I hope that with all the developments that are currently happening in the AI, the biggest impact on training and education that AI will bring is actually the opportunity to create more time to upskill and retrain yourself. Thank you, PK.
Thank you, Anatoly. I think that's a great way to finish. The idea of the importance again of skills, the need for us to upskill ourselves, but also the opportunity now that this presents to us to enable us to take a step back, to create that time so that we can actually integrate learning with work so that we're able to keep pace with these changes. I think is such an important part of the environment that we now stare into, which leads us nicely on to Angela. And I think giving that perspective from a workforce dimension. So, Angela, if you're able to come off mute, but thanks very much for joining us. What do you think, what do you see as those opportunities and threats that this technology provides for our workforce? And I suppose, obviously, don't be afraid to sort of gaze into sort of the finance sector, which is obviously the area that you know most well.
Thanks, PK. So I think if I have a look, firstly, I represent finance workers. So just to give you an idea of the kinds of people that I deal with most of the time, they're bank workers, they're insurance workers, they work in bank branches, call centres, they're claims officers. So some of the threats of this stuff are pretty obvious. And if I can start with kind of taking a gaze backwards, and 20 years ago, there were almost 6,000 bank branches across the country. 5 years ago, there were just 5,000 branches. So it took 15 years to close 5,000 branches. Today, there are only 3,500 branches. So the scale of change is increasing rapidly. But they're the obvious changes. Some of the less obvious changes are that there are thousands of job losses, but they're often hidden behind general automation. So to go to Cherie's point, the difference between Gen AI and just generally automation. But some of the job losses that we're seeing are also hidden behind restructuring and offshoring. And so, for example, you'd go onto a website for your bank or insurer and you'd have a little box pop up that asks if they can help you. That's AI, right? So you don't actually get to a person until the inquiries are more complex. The other thing is that just in time is an issue because finance employers often won't give workers more than 6 to 8 weeks notice that they're going to be out of a job. And you just can't spend 6 to 8 weeks to get upskilled to try and transfer your skills somewhere else. And the workloads are so high, and I've seen some of that in the chat, that you don't have the capacity when you've got high workloads to reskill. And certainly if you've been into a bank branch recently, you'll see that there's a queue out the door. So they're not really all called a bank and you've got a 45-minute wait to talk to someone. So workloads don't provide time or capacity to do this during the day. The other threat we've seen is that workers sometimes have come into banking and insurance without any higher education. So no vet qualifications, no university qualifications, but they've got skills that they've learned on the job, but they're not recognised by the workers themselves. And so they don't have any skills mapping. So what we need to do is we need to try and make sure that in terms of, what are the threats, that we don't replace good quality jobs with bad quality jobs. So some of the characteristics of jobs are that they're secure and have paid leave, that they're flexible jobs, but where the flexibility goes both ways, it's not just flexible with respect to what an employer needs, that they're well remunerated and that they include ongoing training and support. Having said all of that, I do think there are plenty of opportunities because there are heaps of jobs that are being created. And we've seen that these jobs can be done from anywhere that has reliable internet connection. So, COVID lockdowns actually demonstrated to us that work can be done effectively and the remote workers are just as productive as workers on site, despite what you might have read in the media over the past few weeks with employers trying to get people back into the office. We saw during COVID that these are really productive workers. So there are opportunities for workers who are losing jobs in remote and regional parts of the country to pick up some of these new jobs. So, you know, I mentioned earlier that some of these people are going to be facing job losses, and these workers are often really highly skilled, but they haven't actually got any mapping of their skills. So I think there are opportunities with GAI, as the other speakers have said, to use these tools to actually map both the soft skills and the hard skills that these employees have gotten over years of working for banks or insurance companies, so that you can have those skills that would then match up with the education system in terms of the qualifications and the competencies. So if you can map the skills with the current competencies, and then we can use a tool to match the current competencies to jobs for RPLing, for example, then you can actually find these workers who with 6 to 8 weeks notice can reskill because they've got the opportunity to RPL, to have the skills recognised and to understand what in the new economy these skills relate to. So I can really imagine where this is going to add to our industry, but we've got to get employers on board with using those tools for their current workforce to map the skills of the current workforce so they can build in the time to reskill them, and then they can use these skills that they have to RPL against existing competencies and move into spaces where we know there are going to be skills gaps in the next 5 to 10 years. So whilst there are certainly threats to finance workers, it's not all a one-way street. We just need to ensure that the new jobs are good jobs, and we need to think how we can use GAI to support transitioning workers out of parts of the particularly finance industry that are shrinking. Thanks, Pam.
Thanks, Angela. And I think like 2 really important things for me from that, you know, firstly, you know, real people, you know, this will have an impact on real people, and we need to think about that. It's not an academic exercise. You know, this is having an impact upon people, you know, here today. And I think the second point that you made a number of times is the importance of recognizing with real people that they've got real skills, and those skills are transferable, and we need to find a way of making sure that the skills that they have are recognized, because otherwise the shock and awe of this technology of GAI will impact their work. They will not find their way to jobs that they have the potential to fill. And so I think that the RPL dimension of this is super important as we go forward. So thank you for that. So it's now 9:52. There may be some artwork that's going to come on screen. There may not be, but what I'd like you to do now is to take part in a poll. There's 294 people out there. It would be amazing if 294 people could do the poll. So if you go to your 3 dots on top of your screen, there'll be an option that is polls. And there are 4 questions. So really what I'm trying to get a sense of is your view as to how important is it that we get on top of the GAI opportunity or challenge. So do you think it's urgent and that we need to be developing training solutions now that are already focused or that are focused upon upskilling the general workforce? So that's about, let's get people into a position whereby they've got GAI confidence, GAI literacy. Or do you think it's just important at the moment? So you can see it's happening, and do we actually need to spend more time on building the system that's got the right tools, the right frameworks, the content, the best practices? We can take time, but we can build it in a more deliberate way. Or do you think that actually the jury's still out, and that actually we need to learn more about this and conduct further research before we start to take positive action in terms of what it is we do to respond to this? Or do you think we should be doing something completely different, in which case none of the above will do nicely? So if you could sort of like log on to polls and give us an answer. So the 3 dots, if you can't see it on top of your screen, if you go to the 3 dots more in there, it'll come up, I think, on top of the options that you've got. We've got like 6 minutes, no artwork. It will come out eventually, or just have to send it to you. So I'm going to go to Tim, who works on our team, leading our strategy and policy sort of function. And I'm going to ask Tim to field a couple of questions.
Morning, everybody. Yeah, thanks for all the questions. Those that we don't have time to get to today, we will respond to in the next few days. But I might start with a question from Penny McQueen and direct it to Tim Allen. And you've answered this to an extent, but how do we make generative AI accessible for all? That was a pretty common theme that came up around ensuring that we don't exacerbate the digital divide.
Yeah, and thanks, Tim. And would love to get everyone else's view. There's the collective knowledge and experience on this call, from what I can see in the chats, I think is really useful. But like, I think it's using an analogy, ensure that everyone gets to the start line first, so no one's at the end line after each other. And what I mean by that is, like, I think we're in a really interesting component right now where we have some equity. And what I mean by that is these are all new tools for everyone, right? So it's for everyone. No one is kind of ahead of the curve, but that window of opportunity is really, really small by when we're providing access to tools. So when we think about accessibility or opening it up to all, I think there's a couple of factors. Obviously, there is free things like ChatGPT and all that we need to encourage from the sectors that we're in, from if you're in a training component, or even if you're in a family member and you're interacting with your children or your earliest one, is being inquisitive about what these tools are and how they connect to you. The second piece is we need to be really intentional in our specific training and skilling interventions to address what I spoke about before, which is fear to FOMO. Why are people anxious or worried about connecting to these tools? What is the reason? And I think there was something in there about reading anxiety. What are the behavioral barriers that people might come to be able to integrate and understand and explore these new tools? And if I use a couple of examples around that from stakeholder engagement that we've had, and I think I saw something in there around from one of the reports in the chat, which is young people are actually quite anxious about this technology shift, which I thought they would be really excited about. The reason behind that, they've gone through a huge COVID kind of pandemic, we're fundamentally changing what the world looks like. And so there's a little bit of fear and anxiety and understanding. So we need to not just push things down people's throats, but actually address their needs where they're at just in time. Same thing as how we support, our marginalized and vulnerable communities, our regional and remote. It's about providing access and skilling opportunities for the needs of that individual for where they're at, to move them to the next point, be able to go a little bit deeper in skilling. So I think there's meeting people where they're at. The last piece is obviously just access. And there's a few elements of access. We still have places where we don't have internet access around Australia, which is going to be key and critical. Access to quality hardware, we'll be able to address some of these things as well. But I think that's going to be a really important issue that we're going to have to address, both inside of our organisations, our communities, and organisations like us at Microsoft and government as well. So hopefully that's a useful contribution, but love to hear the comments from everyone else.
Thanks, Tim. I appreciate that. I might just ask one other question. There was a pretty common theme around teachers and digital literacy, how to support teachers in the implementation, activation of generative AI in the classroom. And PK, I was going to direct this one to you actually before we wrap up.
Thank you. That was completely unprepared for that one. I think what we do know is that teachers and trainers are sort of fundamental to delivering any type of knowledge. If they don't have the basic skills to enable them to teach in a digitally minded way, then that knowledge, that influence that they have upon so many people across our nation doesn't come across. And so I think if we're going to get to scale, then teachers are absolutely at the heart of getting to scale. So what do we need to do to help teachers and trainers sort of develop the skills that they need to be able to deliver this training in a digitally minded way? I think is one of the highest priority actions that we should be thinking about. And that's not just about AI, it's about digital skills more generally. So I think it's at the core of the problems that we should be trying to focus on. Thank you for that question, Tim. We got like 2 minutes. I'm going to wrap up. The artwork is out there somewhere, but you're not going to see it today. We'll send it to you. It's going to be excellent, I'm sure. Not everything can be perfect. Just trying to sort of pull all this together, very difficult. I think, but maybe 4 points. Firstly, this is about everybody. It's impacting everybody. It's happening now. And if all of that is true, then we need to be thinking very hard about how do we respond to that and how quickly do we do that. This is about productivity at the end of the day. And productivity and the opportunity that comes from that for individuals, for companies, for our nation is huge. And look at that, the picture has come up with 1 minute to go to try and explain it. But what Glenn's tried to do here has to capture the conversation as we've gone through it. So it talks to some of the major themes that have come through. We'll send this to you, and I love that one on the left-hand side called out, you know, Tim, from your side, which is this is an opportunity for all Australians. I think our challenge is how do we take advantage of that. Happy Christmas. Thank you very much.